Dave Trobert talking about tax policy.
Thanks, James. So you've probably heard over the last few years a lot of people who were opposed to tax cuts saying, they were pointing to the Kansas experience and saying, look, this proves that you can't cut taxes. It can't be done. But at the same time, states like North Carolina, Indiana, Tennessee were all successfully cutting taxes. So the real issue is what was different about the Kansas experience. Some of the things that were said about Kansas weren't true, but we really did have some serious budget issues, and a lot of that was avoidable. There were a lot of mistakes made. There were some other circumstances at play, including a pretty toxic political environment. So we decided that we had to tell this story and write down, document the history so that we could help legislators and citizens across the country understand what really happened and hopefully inform their efforts to reduce taxes in their states and maybe eventually reduce taxes in Kansas. So I want to talk about three of the big avoidable mistakes. Number one, don't cut taxes and increase spending. It's a fourth grade math problem. It'll come back to haunt you. Number two, make sure you have a plan in place to balance the budget. And number three, have the right systems in place. So, you know, the narrative was that state spending had been cut, devastated, cut back to the Stone Age, all kinds of crazy things were said. In reality, spending kept going up. In fact, the year that the tax cuts were passed, 2012, the legislature approved a $400 million spending increase. And we set record after record thereafter. There was only one time we didn't set a record, and that's because Capers pension payments were delayed to make it look like we weren't spending money, but we just kicked that can down the road. If you look historically, you see that spending has grown much faster than inflation. In fact, if you go back to 1995, the dashed line you're looking at shows what spending would be for inflation, and the solid red line is actual. So we're now spending $1.7 billion more per year than if we had just increased spending for inflation. The same is true of tax revenue. Tax revenue is $1.9 billion higher than long-term inflation. We don't have a tax problem, we have a spending problem in Kansas. Now, the tax burden is worse. I just saw a tweet come in while I was in the back of the room pushing this narrative that, well, tax rates are still lower than they were in 2012. And what they're not saying when they say that is, in other words, there's still room to increase them. The reality is that the tax burden is worse than it was in 2012. The income tax rates are a little bit lower than in 2012, but there was a big sales tax increase, and there were some other changes like cigarette tax increases. Legislative research calculation shows that the total tax revenue, the total tax burden is worse than it was in 2012. So another thing that was done in 2017 that gets no attention in the media is that tens of thousands of the lowest earners in Kansas who were exempt from income tax under the Brownback years were put back on the tax rolls. They changed the level at which you start paying tax, so lowest earners really got added back in. Now, when this all started, we had a lot of conservatives come to us and say, look, we love this idea. We definitely need to reduce our taxes, but how are we going to run government on less money? And so we went out and did the research, and it was kind of embarrassing. It's like, duh, it's the spending. There's only one thing that determines how much any government taxes, and that's how much it chooses to spend providing the services. What we found was that, obviously every state provides the same basket of services, education and highways and social services and so forth, but the states that tax income now spend 50% more per resident than the states without an income tax. 50%, that's not a rounding error. And we looked, and this is the most recent data available on the 50-state comparison. Kansas in 2016 spent 36% more per resident than the states without an income tax. And so that's why we were telling legislators all along that all Kansas needed to do was go from being morbidly inefficient to grossly inefficient to get the budget balanced. Yeah, that's it. We actually ran a test in 2012. We needed to reduce costs by about 8.5%. And that could have been done over a period of 2 or even 3 years. Just wring a little bit of waste out, and we could have balanced the budget with spending growing with revenues going forward and always having healthy ending balances. But there wasn't any reason, there wasn't any political will to do that, and we'll touch on that in a minute. We also found in that research that the states that tax less not only spend less, not only tax less, they actually grow more. What you're looking at here is a comparison of GDP growth and private sector job growth. The states that without an income tax had 129% GDP growth over that period compared to 100% for the other states. We look job growth, 40% versus 21%. Kansas was at 12%. We also looked at it one other way with total state and local tax burden, same dynamic. It's not that if you cut, this is not one of those bivariate analyses we talked about earlier. It's not that if you cut taxes, this will automatically happen, but it is one of the big factors that leads to it. So there was no plan to balance the budget. Unbelievably, there was never a plan on paper to balance the budget. Governor Brownback's first plan was to cut taxes by $350 million over 5 years. When that plan left the House, it was $1 billion cut over 5 years. And then when it got to the Senate, they did the double dog dare you, pushed it to $3.5 billion over 5 years. And Governor Brownback did try to, once the House passed that, he had 10 days to sign it, and he wouldn't sign it. He kept going back to the Senate saying, would you please reduce this? The House is willing to reduce it. I don't think we can afford this. The House is willing to reduce it. And Senator Donovan from Wichita was on the Senate Negotiating Committee. He was willing to. There were a lot of deals discussed. He was not allowed by Senate leadership to make those changes. He was not allowed to because they were going to call the bluff. At no point, even after they said, look, it's $3.5 billion, and they didn't think they could afford it because everybody knew that 2 years in, there was a giant hole in the budget. Once the reserves were gone, giant hole. At no point was there ever a plan put on paper to balance the budget. Have the right systems in place. One of the challenges in reducing waste is identifying it. And Kansas didn't have a system in place a budget system that would make it easy for legislators to identify opportunities. I mean, there were some opportunities that were available, and there wasn't political will to do it. There were some people who wanted to, but the majority wouldn't entertain it. We need to have a better budget system. They did pass what's called a performance-based budget system a couple of years ago, which requires every program and service provided by every agency to be analyzed not just for cost effectiveness, but for overall program effectiveness. And then you rank them, and then you can identify where we can best utilize resources. They gave themselves 3 years to put it in place. Conversation with the state budget director a couple of weeks ago said, this is the 3rd year it's supposed to be ready to go. He said it's at least another 2 years away. So they're going to come in January and still not have what they need. We're working on a lot of deep dives into the budget to provide some information, but that's still a serious problem. Having a reliable revenue estimating system is another challenge. Kansas has a revenue estimating program, but it's not been very accurate. You probably heard Kansas was missing a lot of revenue estimates while they were trying to balance the budget. And you were probably led to believe that this was some new phenomenon. It's actually about as common as the wind blowing in Kansas. I mean, in reality, we missed revenues by larger margins in the 10 years leading up to the tax cuts than we did during the tax cuts. That's all laid out in the book. You just weren't told about it. Media didn't have a reason to tell you about it. They weren't pushing you to do anything differently. There were some big myths exposed in the book. One of them is, of course, that what started out as that $3.5 billion tax cut over 5 years wasn't really implemented. Long term, only about half of that tax cut was implemented because in 2013, Governor Brownback did come back and propose shaving some of that back by changing some of the deductions. And then when the budget still wasn't balanced in 2015, We had a big sales tax increase, and there were a couple other minor tax increases along the way. Bottom line, about 53% of that tax cut, that initially proposed tax cut, was implemented. There was also a lot of speculation about tax avoidance. The tax plan had two major elements to it. One was reducing marginal rates, and that's where the big money was. The other part was what came to be known as the LLC exemption, where pass-through business income for small businesses was exempt from income tax. Well, that's when the first estimates were made, the state said there'd be about 190,000 entities eligible to take the LLC exemption. But when the first years of tax returns were processed, there were 333,000 companies claiming the exemption. And so that led to speculation that there had been a lot of companies changing tax status. In reality, it was the 190,000 estimate that was wrong. Those exemptions are reported on 3 separate federal schedules, Schedule C, E, and F. And there were 190,000 entities claiming it on Schedule C. If you add up Schedule E and Schedule F, there were 330,000 the year before, and then there were 333,000 the year after. So there was, now how much of that was organic growth versus, because things had been growing, but there wasn't any rampant tax avoidance. That was just speculation. There was also, the Department of Revenue tracked the conversion from C corporation to LLC, and there was only a tiny uptick in the percentage of companies that were doing that. There always were some, and there was a little bit higher incident thereafter. There was also an independent academic study that looked at this process, a university professor from outside Kansas, and they concluded they attributed about 2% of the revenue decline to tax avoidance. So there was a bit, but it wasn't the reason the budget wasn't balancing. The toxic political environment was one of the big factors that had really nothing to do with tax policy, but it was a major factor. You might remember in 2010 when Governor Brownback was elected, media was speculating it may have been 50 years since Kansas had had a conservative governor, and from that day forward the plan was put in place to make sure that never happened again. And one of the ways it manifested itself was with this tax plan. I mean, whether legislators agreed or disagreed with the plan, every one of them has a fiduciary responsibility to balance the budget. And yet, Democrats and many Republicans refused to entertain any means of reducing costs or increasing revenues. There was what came to be known as a kind of a burn it down mentality in the Capitol. A lot of people would rather see the whole thing implode so that we'd never have those nasty old conservatives in charge again. And here's a great example. That LLC exemption came up for a vote in 2016 in the House. And I mean, for years, a lot of people, a lot of legislators have been saying it has to go away. It's evil. It's the reason we're having this problem. It failed in the House by 19 votes, with 24 Democrats and moderate Republicans voting against it. People who'd been saying year after year, this must go away. Here's your opportunity. Now let's keep it. Now, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Well, it was an election year. And Senator Laura Kelly finally told the Capitol Journal, it's in the book, well, if we'd done that, we'd lose all our leverage. What leverage was that? Well, see, citizens had been told that if the LLC went away, well, that was the whole thing. So that was the reason it was not balancing. So if it went away, well, then problem solved. And if the problem's solved, we don't need to get rid of conservatives and vote in more Democrats and moderates. The other leverage was that they did want to get rid of the LLC, but what they really wanted to do was raise your individual rates, because that's where the big money is. And again, there's no, where's the reason to do that? They needed the fear to be out there. And so they said, no, and even the Wichita Eagle called those 24 people cowards for not standing up for their principles. I mean, that was eye-opening. So, what are some of the other factors at play? Well, Kansas is an oil state. And we all know that we have oil is a bigger issue, and we're not at the level of Texas or Oklahoma, but it's a much bigger factor of our economy. And in 2014, the worst possible time, when they were out of reserves and entering that deep hole, oil prices plummeted. And what that led to was a loss of about $200 million in severance taxes over 2 years. And at the same time that happened, farm commodity prices plummeted. And so we ended up, even though in 2015 we raised the sales tax, a lot of counties in Kansas lost sales tax revenue because they had the double whammy of agriculture and oil and gas. And so we had these other factors going on. Now, so summarizing the lessons learned, don't cut taxes and increase spending. That'll come back to bite you pretty quick. Have a plan to balance the budget, and ideally make it about having government operate more efficiently. If they had explained that, look, here's our plan, we know we're spending 30-odd% more than we need to, we're going to find the waste and pull it out, and that's what's going to lead to you. Well, people buy into that. Make it about that. Have a plan and explain it. Get the right systems in place and be careful how you characterize things. Governor Brownback took a lot of heat for saying it'll be a shot of adrenaline in the arm. So, people do that. We all do it. I've seen me do it. Honey, this is really going to work out great. Be careful about that. And so learning these lessons is really important. We worked with Kansas Legislative Research to get their calculations of what this huge school funding increase is going to really cost. And it's $3.7 billion. There's a revenue shortfall over the next 4 years. That's if we don't transfer money from the highway fund, if we make our CAPERS pension payments on time, and if we comply with state law on the ending balance, have 7.5% in reserves. The funding that's been approved and the funding that the Department of Education estimates will take to satisfy the court again leaves us $3.7 billion short. Now, about $600 million of that is already in place. That's the backdoor increase that is coming as a result of changes from the federal tax cuts. Like doubling the standard deduction means that more people will take that instead of itemizing. And if you itemize for federal, or if you don't itemize for federal, you can't itemize for state. There's some other changes that affect individuals and businesses. And the estimate from legislative research is $624 million more in state income tax over the next 4 years. $2.1 billion is the shortfall created by the funding that's already been approved by the legislature. And another $940 million is the long-term cost, or the 4-year cost, of granting another $365 million. Now you're probably wondering, well, how does $365 million turn into $940? Well, the $365 is the Department of Education says, well, we need to add about $91 million a year. So it's $91 million next year. The second year, it's $181 million or $182 million. I can't do the math myself. Over the 2 years ago, then it's 273, and then it's 365. So you add all that up, and you're at 940 million over 4 years. So what are we going to do? Now, media is aware of this. This has been out for a month. Media won't ask any candidate for any office, how will you balance the budget? They won't do it because it might force some of their friends into a corner. People out saying we need to invest more. Where's it going to? Wait a minute, we've got a deep hole. Where's it going to come from? This is what's coming, and this is why it's so important that we understand the lessons in that plan. We just did some recent polling. 69% of citizens say that the legislature should take action to prevent that federal backdoor tax increase. The Senate did vote this year to repeal it, to change it, prevent it from happening. The House wouldn't pass it. They wanted to spend more money. We also asked, what about willingness to pay higher taxes to close the $3 billion shortfall? Only 37% said they would be willing to pay higher taxes. Again, citizens don't want this, so they need to know it's coming. Media refuses to tell them that it's coming. Candidates sure aren't going to tell them because then they have to say what they're going to do about it. Now, voter opinions, again, we talked about this with the education issue, heavily skewed by what they perceive to be reality. So, for example, on willing to pay higher taxes, 26% of the ones willing to pay higher taxes don't know what school funding is. 65% of the opposition or the willingness says, I think it's less than $10,000. Very small, only 10% of the people willing to pay higher taxes think that spending is over $10,000. So even though there's 37%, a lot of that is probably, if you told them the truth, they'd say, well, wait a minute, let me rethink that. So, and aside from income taxes, how should we close the budget? The 50% say use money left over from prior years. Not just schools, agencies have money left over from prior years as well. There's other ways to do it. And we're going to close with this. Why is this so important? Because we're in our 4th consecutive decade of economic stagnation. We've been falling farther and farther behind the nation on GDP growth and on private sector job growth. So the question is, how will taxing people more make this any better? The simple answer is it won't. But this is why it's so important. If you want to grow, if you want to have more jobs, have job growth go faster, you can't make the economy worse. So we have to figure out how we're going to fund schools, how we're going to provide services, and still have an economy that can grow. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to defer to people who haven't already asked one. With that being said, if everybody's bashful, then we'll just get with whomever. So raise your hand if you've got a question. We're pressed for time, so I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's it.
I just wanted to ask you, these are the facts that you're presenting to us. When are you going to recommend any solutions? Is there going to be another summit that's going to say, these are the solutions we have for these kind of things?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And we have. The voter issue guide that's on our website. Now, we have some in the handouts in the back, yes. We don't propose solutions in there because we had to keep it all on one page. But there are a lot of solutions. We just published an article Monday on our website with a partial list of solutions to how to avoid a tax increase. There are a lot of ways it can be done.
So my question is a little bit similar, but because we know that the budget, the vast majority of the state general funds are K through 12 education and the caseloads, it's all going up. So is efficiencies, are you saying the efficiencies can, take care of that $3.7 billion over 4 years? I mean, where are we making those cuts?
Sure. So one of the options, for example, is you're not obligated as a legislator to spend that money on schools. You could tell the Supreme Court, thank you for your opinion, see you next year. And not provide the $365 million more that they want. That's $1 billion worth of the shortfall right there. You could say, because no legislature can bind a future legislature, you could say, we don't really think we need to spend that amount of money that the last legislature approved. You could shave that back. You could say you don't need to have all those cash reserves. So if we're going to spend some of that money now, we're going to also make you spend down some of your cash reserves first. If you took that reserve level down to, say, 15% from the current roughly 19%, that would save you about $250 million. It's one time, but it's a lot of money. There's a lot of things like that. Now, you also could transfer money out of the highway fund. That's about $300 million a year. You could do things like securitized tobacco. That might be another $300 million a year. Some of these things are not ideal budget solutions, but compared to a tax increase, it beats the heck out of a tax increase.
Last question right over here.
No.
Thanks, Dave. As you guys know, I lived through that. In 2000, I took office in 13, and much to Susan's deal, 90% of our budget is caseloads, social services, and education. So we're going to have to get pretty tough, and it's going to come out of those. I mean, we could wipe out the rest of our entire budget and still not even put the kind of dollars that you're talking about saving on the table. So I think that's always been the problem, is that we've got to get tough with education and social services. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of my
You know, we're also preparing a deep dive into spending, taking a different approach. We've been able to get at more information, and we're going to be, before the legislative session starts, we'll be publishing a long list of very tough questions that can be asked. Like, for example, why did we spend $22 million last year on employment agencies? How much of the $22 million we spend on dues and subscriptions is mission critical? Why is travel going up? I mean, because that's the information that's never given to legislators. We've been able to dive in, and we'll be able to provide schedules on that by agency so that you can change the whole process. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Dave.